Welcome to The Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was Porter Robinson with Language. And that song kicks us off on a string of recent science news that I want to go through this week. And the first of these is the finding that our brains appear to be hardwired to produce language. And this result has come from a study that was interested in asking the question, why are there some universals across all human languages? And then thinking about the implications of these universals that we see. So for example, researchers have wondered whether maybe some syllables are harder to hear or to articulate, and so there may be some physical constraints on language. There also is the possibility that there might be cultural constraints. So for example, some syllables just might be rarer because of historical coincidence. So maybe there's a particular language family that does really well and it spreads really far and affects lots of other languages, and so the traits that you find within that original language are the ones that are kind of passed on, and so those other things just don't develop. You don't have these kind of rarer syllables because they simply are outnumbered by the more common ones. But then the other question, or another question that was asked by this particular study, was maybe whether there might be some evolutionary origins for the type of language that we have and for the types of syllables that you see emerging in these languages across all humans. And this would come from potentially the fact that human brains might share certain characteristics that predispose us all to use or to avoid particular syllables. And so in order to investigate this, researchers looked at brain activity in the study subjects in response to exposure to different types of syllable. So these people were listening to syllables while also having a brain scan performed. So the researchers could see what areas of the brain were lighting up in response to hearing these acoustic cues. And they used two different types of syllables. Some of them were commonly found across all languages, and other ones were more infrequently found and actually were quite rare. And they give a few examples of this in the write-up that I was reading, and actually they're not the kinds of syllables that we would find to be very normal in English. So things like bliff and BNIF are things that they consider to be common, but other ones like BDIF and LBIF are uncommon. And what's kind of interesting about this is that they are looking at English-speaking study subjects, but a lot of these syllables, as you might guess from what I've just now described, these are actually taken from other languages that are quite common around the world. And so they actually are looking at people who are unfamiliar with these syllables whatsoever, but they do have some reactions to them that look quite different depending on whether these syllables are the more common ones or the less common ones around the world. So study subjects heard only one syllable at a time, and then they were asked to determine whether the auditory stimulus contained either one or two syllables. Now, as you can imagine, with a syllable like bliff or BNIF, it's quite hard to maybe say some of these things, and so because that is quite awkward wording, the B and the N right next to each other, it might come out sounding like two syllables instead of one. So it's all about how the brain processes these. Does it process them quite easily and kind of put all of that sound into a single syllable? Or is it struggling to hear all those and kind of breaking them up into little bits as it's processing them and making them multiple syllables? And people did have a harder time processing syllables that were infrequent or poorly formed, and they were looking also at different recordings of these different syllables to see how kind of the delivery of the syllable as well as the absolute syllable itself was impacting this response. And this difficulty was something that could be detected in the brain scans. So when they looked within the brains of people that were listening to these things, they found that unfamiliar syllables taxed areas of the brain associated with auditory processing, so just purely hearing a sound or not hearing a sound. But they were also, they were expecting potentially that there would be this lighting up of the areas of the brain that were associated with articulation and lexical processing. So the sorts of areas of the brain that we use when we're actually going about the process of making speech and decoding speech from others. But they actually didn't find this. So those areas were not lit up at all. But they did see activation of something called Broca's area, which is a primary language center in the human brain. So in other words, what the differences in these lighting patterns reflect is the fact that people didn't have difficulty with these syllables simply because they were unfamiliar, because they were difficult to detect from the environment. Maybe our ears weren't built to hear these things, or maybe we struggle with them because they're quite hard for us to say, and so we didn't quite understand the motor skills used to put that into sound. But none of those things appear to be the case. However, it seems to be that people are fundamentally differently responding to these things because of the linguistic structures. So there are these kind of universal things that are either liked or disliked by our brains. And it doesn't matter that the study participants were native English speakers. It didn't matter that they were hearing syllables from non-English languages. There seems to be this innate ability to discriminate between things that are liked and disliked across all human languages, and kind of to then rank the syllables in a hierarchy. So things that are liked, you respond to that in one way. Things that aren't liked, you really struggle and you don't respond to it at all. Now, the fact that the English speakers hadn't encountered most of the syllables before, but then still responded to them, similarly to how a native speaker might respond to them, supports the researchers' idea that there are these common linguistic restrictions on sound patterns, and that you can find those around the world no matter who you survey. And of course, a nice, interesting follow-up study to this research would be to look at these very same things in people from other countries who speak other languages, and to see if they do, in fact, have similar patterns as those that were found here. Now, another thing that's interesting about this study is that it does support some other research that looked also at language, and you might have heard about this because I think it did make headlines in some pretty big news outlets. And this was work that compared the reactions of newborn babies who had never experienced language before to those of adults. And again, the fact that babies were responding in a very similar way to the adults, even though they had no previous experience hearing these syllables or knowing what the syllables mean, that suggests again that there is this kind of innate universal syllable hierarchy that we're all born with. It's hardwired into our brains, and so we're able to process things and classify them as either familiar or unfamiliar, or good or bad, however you want to call it, that we have this ability to do that. And what this now raises the question of us is to whether this emerged as a result of some of our earliest attempts at language, in our distant ancestors, as they were beginning to make kind of vocal noises and use these noises to communicate with each other. Were there some things that just worked better than others, and so we developed this preference for them in some way, and we relied on those more than others? Or was there this kind of hardwiring even before that happened? And so because we had that hardwiring and liked certain things more than others and responded to them, that's how our languages were shaped. If it did precede them, why would the brain even make those distinctions to begin with? Why would that hardwiring be there? Is it purely chance, or is there some sort of a reason? And of course, the next question is, can we actually begin to answer these questions? And one of the ways we could maybe do that is to perform some comparative studies looking at other primates. Because of course we can't look at our own ancestors, but we do know that we are quite closely related to other primates, and that there are certain areas of the brain that function very similarly, that some primates like orangutans and gorillas can actually use language, not verbal language, but they can use sign language, which does activate many of the same regions of the brain. So maybe we can somehow concoct some sort of comparative studies to try to get at these questions, to try to figure out kind of which came first, the hardwiring or the language. Welcome back to The Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was the Weepies with Orbiting. And on this week's episode of the show, I'm talking about some recent science news, because I haven't done that for a while, and there are a few interesting things that have happened. And the next thing I want to talk about is the fact that astronomers have discovered the first potentially habitable Earth-sized exoplanet. And this was done by originally by the Kepler Space Telescope, which is up in orbit, and then it was confirmed by some data that were collected by the WM Keck and the Gemini observatories, which are in Mauna Kea, Hawaii. And you've probably seen images of these before at some point or another, because they're always featuring in any kind of stuff on the television about Hawaii or about astronomy, they always have images of these because they do have amazing views of the stars because they're up really high and they tend to be in places that they don't get a whole lot of cloud cover, and so they're up there and they're able to get these really amazing clear images of the stars without anything interfering. And so they've been able to collect this amazing data looking at stuff that's just incredibly far away that has allowed researchers to find this planet that's very Earth-like and might in fact have the right conditions to have life. So not only have these guys discovered an Earth-sized planet, which is kind of a first, within this habitable zone type area, and just to remind you, I have talked about habitable zones in the past, and those are kind of the zones away from a star where it's not so hot that you're going to have the water all vaporizing and it's not so cold that the water is all going to be freezing. It's right in the middle where water is going to be in liquid format, and where we think that potentially the conditions would be right because of this for there to maybe be life. But what's exciting about this is not only have they done all of that, but they've also found several other planets that are orbiting the same star. So they've found this kind of solar system, that's not dissimilar to ours. And this finally does provide confirmation that there are other stars with Earth-sized planets, and that ours is not the only one. People were beginning to wonder whether maybe stars like ours and planets like ours, is there something where this is actually quite an uncommon thing? Do you normally have a really big star with tiny planets or a little star with big planets? Do you not find something kind of, we've got kind of a moderate sun and a moderate planet, but now in fact we do know that this isn't the only case. You do find it elsewhere in the galaxies, in the universe. And so this planet that they found resides in this nice temperate region where you've got water in liquid form. And the host star is named Kepler 186, a really catchy name. And it's classified as an M1 type dwarf star, and it's in the constellation Cygnus. And you might have seen Cygnus in the past, but you probably haven't seen this star. If so, you are really amazing, because actually it's incredibly faint. So it's about 500,000 times fainter than the faintest stars that we can see without optics. And that is despite the fact that it's actually relatively close to our solar system. So it's about 500 light years away. And I know actually that doesn't sound close at all, but it's all relative. In space, things can be incredibly distant, so that is pretty close to us, astronomically speaking. And because this sun is so dim, it's much cooler than our own sun. And despite this, actually 4 of those 5 planets that are orbiting it have very short period orbits. So this means, in other words, that they're quite close to the star, so they have very small orbits, kind of like Mercury might be in our solar system. And just like Mercury is incredibly hot, not very hospitable, that's probably the case with these 4 stars. So it's quite interesting that despite the fact that the majority of the planets around the sun are not very comfortable, this 1/5 planet, which has been named Kepler 186f, another very catchy name, it is far enough out that actually it is more comfortable and it's much more Earth-like. So despite the fact that this description makes it sound like, it's pretty close, it's only 500 light years away, actually it's quite difficult to see these sorts of things with the devices that we have. We tend to have stuff that's good at looking either really close or really far, and anything that's in between actually is quite hard to resolve. And you can see things kind of generally and kind of vaguely, but then you can't really tell the detail. And when you're thinking about looking at a sun with lots of little planets around it, you need to have detail so that you can count the number of planets, so that you can make sure that they're actually planets and not some other kind of astronomical feature. And so this is why they've had to use so many devices in order to collect these data. So as I said, this all started off with the Kepler telescope, and it detected the planet by identifying planetary transits. And these can be thought of as basically a series of little eclipses, because you've got the host star that's orbiting you've got the host star and then the orbiting planets. And as the planets are crossing in between us and the star, they are, causing a shift in how much light the telescope is picking up, because they are obscuring some of that light. And so that's the little eclipse. And so the Kepler is picking this up as a change, a diminishing and then a growing again of the brightness of that star. And the variation in brightness is only a first cue. you then have to follow that up to actually get a bit more detail and find out if indeed these are planets or some other thing. Because for all you know, that could just be noise in the signal. It's not actually anything real. And so far, Kepler has actually been able to do this with about 3,800 or more possible planets. And so, of course, researchers are having to take quite a lot of time to go through all of those results and follow them up and try to get more data. So the next step after you have done that is to eliminate all these other potential explanations. Like I said, it could be lots of things, including, nothing at all. It could just be chance that you're having this kind of waffling back and forth in how much brightness there is. So the images, for example, could show a background star. They could show a stellar companion, so it might be that there are two suns that are kind of orbiting each other in a little pair, and both of those could look very similar to a planet. And this is where the ground-based telescopes came into play after those original Kepler images had been analyzed. So the Gemini telescope, it has an 8-meter lens, and it was used to perform something called speckle imaging. And then the Keck 2 telescope, which has a 10-meter lens, was used to perform adaptive optics observations. Now, of course, the size of the lens has a huge impact on how much light is coming in and how much data these things can collect. And basically, the bigger the lens, the more light that they're able to absorb, and so the more data. But depending on what sort of light they are absorbing, you're going to get different types of data. And that's why you've got both the Gemini and the Keck 2 being used. So the Gemini data, with the speckle data, it could see to within about 400 million miles of the actual system. And this is about 4 times the distance between the Earth and the Sun, or approximately the same distance that Jupiter is from the Sun. So it's not, you might want it to be within a couple miles, which would be amazing, but it's also not incredibly far away. We're not talking about looking towards the end of the whole solar system, out to the edge of the universe. We actually do have something that's kind of, a decent distance where you can get fair enough resolution to see what's going on. And because they were able to collect these data, they could in fact see that there were no other stellar-sized objects within that kind of distance from the star, which suggests that it wasn't a pair of stars orbiting each other, but in fact it's more likely to be a planet. And this instrument works by taking lots of short exposure images of an object and then kind of comparing all these, because that allows you to see what is noise and what is actually data, and then strip away the noise so that you're just left with the information about what it is you're looking at. On the other hand, the adaptive optics from the Keck 2 telescope, they aren't able to look quite as close, but what they do see, which is going to be a bit, it's kind of like the difference between zooming in on your camera and not zooming in. So the Gemini is kind of zoomed in, but the Keck 2 is kind of pulled back a little bit, but it's much, much clearer. And the reason that it's much clearer is that the system uses near-infrared imaging, and so it creates these very sharp images at these near-infrared wavelengths. And basically the images are so clear that they're comparable to those, and maybe even better than those, produced by the Hubble Space Telescope. And you've probably seen lots of these. You might have them as your desktop. And actually the Hubble Space Telescope uses optical wavelengths, but near-infrared uses a different type of wavelength. But it doesn't really matter, because the point is that they're picking up these wavelengths of different types of light, and they're able to process those into an image that we can see. And this is actually the same technique that was recently used to finally prove the existence of a black hole at the center of our galaxy. And so, of course, this is something that can really show you a lot of information if it's able to see something that you can't even see. So cumulatively, the fact that you've got the Kepler stuff and the Gemini stuff and the Keck 2 stuff, all of this allowed the researchers to calculate the probability that this really is a planet orbiting around this sun. And the probability is about 99.98% that they are correct, that this is an Earth-sized planet that's in the habitable zone of this star that's about 500 million miles away. And so that's a very exciting thing, because this is maybe something that we could shoot for in terms of sending out some sort of a satellite, sending out some sort of a signal, and investigating maybe one day whether there is life on a planet very much like ours, not too far away in the solar system. Welcome back to The Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was Brooke Fraser with Seeds. And on this week's show, I'm talking about some recent science news. And the next story that I want to discuss is the fact that characteristics of plant seeds have been found to be associated with speciocity. And I'm not sure if I'm making up that word or not, but I think you get the idea. So the number of species that a plant eventually could give rise to. So let's just back up a little bit before I think about the evolution of different plants. Let's think about the purpose of seeds and how seeds act. So of course seeds are carrying on your genetic data into the next generation. And the whole point of this is to make sure that you can produce a sort of seed that is capable of doing that given the environment that you live in. So depending on how your seed acts, it's going to be more or less successful in those given environmental conditions. So seeds that immediately produce sprouts are going to be quite good in places where they need to quickly take advantage of resources so they can outcompete rivals, or maybe there's a habitat like a desert where there's only going to be a really short period of time in which you can actually sprout and reproduce and carry on the generation after that. So in those sorts of environments, it's going to be very beneficial to go from seed to sprout to adult really quickly. But in other types of habitats, it's going to be much better if the seed waits a bit before it sprouts, because then it can kind of wait out inclement weather conditions. It can last through late frosts or dry spells or anything that's maybe kind of unanticipated, and you don't know quite so much what's going on. So maybe in a habitat that's a bit more inconsistent in its conditions. And based on the environmental conditions where a plant grows, species will begin to evolve seeds that are somewhere along that kind of fast to slow sprouting continuum, and that is where you would expect to see them kind of generation after generation. There might be a bit of variation, but more or less you're going to have kind of an optimum that the majority, maybe the average, will kind of fall there in that optimum situation. Now, although it's appropriate in terms of kind of optimizing survival and reproduction for a species to hit that optimum, so to maybe have quick sprouting seeds or longer dormancy, whatever the case might be, in these species where it is appropriate to have the quicker sprouting seeds, they still have found that longer dormancy can be associated with other benefits, and probably vice versa as well, to be honest. But in this case, the study was focusing on the fact that longer dormancy actually appears to allow species to give rise to lots of other species and to kind of extend the plant family, so to speak. So in other words, plants that have long dormant seeds not only give rise to more individual plantlets, in the end they're ultimately more reproductively successful, but they also are able to give rise to whole new species. So why is dormancy so helpful? Well, plant seedlings are very vulnerable, and of course if you think about the garden that you might have out back or on your allotment, you know that when things first come up, it's really easy for them to be nibbled on by something, or to be hurt by the rain if it rains really hard, to be washed away if it rains hard enough to create a flood, all sorts of bad things. If there happens to be a drought, little plants aren't able to weather it quite as well. So it's quite difficult for these guys because they don't have things like thorns and woody tissues and full-scale chemical defenses, things like that adult plants would eventually put into place to protect them from the outside world. But when they're remaining inside their seed coats for longer, they can kind of go into a state of suspended animation where they aren't growing, they of course aren't receding, they aren't getting less young, they're also not getting any older, they're just staying where they are, and they're hanging on to the protection that they've got around them in those kind of sturdier tissues of the seed. So think, for example, of an avocado or a peanut, where you've got that really hard nut that is protecting the little baby that eventually will grow out of it. So something like an avocado pit is obviously going to be really good protection for the seedling that eventually will emerge from it. And a peanut, actually, you can take a peanut that you buy in the store, put it in kind of moist conditions, stick it in the sun, and it eventually will sprout out. And you may not even have guessed that was possible because they are quite hard. They don't seem like they have much going on, but that's just because they are dormant. And if you take those and allow them to have the right conditions, that dormant seed can then produce a little sprout. So obviously that is quite a safe condition for those little plantlings to kind of remain in for a while. And some plants can do this for hundreds of years, or sometimes even thousands of years. And actually the longest record known is a date palm that was recovered from some Israeli ruins, and it was successfully planted. So after 2,000 years just lying dormant, it was able to produce a seedling and grow into something else. Now the current study was comparing the evolutionary trees, no pun intended, associated with these different patterns of kind of dormancy or not dormancy by looking through a global data set that had been compiled over 40-some years by a husband and wife team from the University of Kentucky. And these guys had collected data from over 14,000 different species of all sorts of plants. So things like trees and shrubs and vines and herbs. So it really looked at all the different types of life histories that you might have out there, which means that you have all sorts of different types of seeds, all sorts of different types of kind of seed growth speed represented in this data set. And all of these were mapped onto a giant seed plant family tree in order to see which types of these seed characteristics were associated with particular traits. And what they found when they did this was that new species were more likely to emerge from plants that had a greater ability to regulate the timing of germination. So in other words, those that were more capable of lying dormant rather than immediately sprouting were the ones that eventually gave rise to more and more species. So again, to put that in even other words, seed dormancy is related to diversification. And likely, there are many things that you could imagine that this would result from, but likely it's because the seed in the plant can more exactly adapt itself to the particular niche in which it finds itself. So dormancy makes it easier for plants to colonize new environments, for example, because it can facilitate safe and protected travel to new places. So this is what we see with mangrove seeds that will fall from the trees in which they've grown, and then they can go hundreds, thousands of miles bobbing along in the ocean, pitch up on a new sandy shore somewhere, put down roots, and grow up. So that would be a case where you would have to have a seed that's quite durable, able to go quite a long way before it finds that new environment and then grows. Dormancy also can prevent plants from incorrectly sprouting in conditions that would not be favorable. So for example, when you've got the wrong temperature or the wrong moisture level, if you are going to sprout regardless, then you might suddenly have a little plant emerge and then find itself in completely the wrong conditions and immediately die. But when you've got something that can kind of adjust to wait out until it finds certain conditions, that means that whatever niche it finds itself in, as long as that niche eventually presents those conditions, then the plant can go into growth mode and grow up into a new adult and then reproduce. And so that means that every time it finds itself in a new place, it can kind of just wait it out and find the exact niche that it needs and then grow, which means that each of these plants has the ability to send lots of seeds out to lots of locations where the seeds can then, in each one of those, do the little adaptation that it needs in order to grow up and produce something new. And that means that you can potentially have lots and lots of new species eventually emerging if each of those different places is, it's maybe more distant from the parent climate. You can't have gene flow. Maybe you've got just some little change in when it's coming about. Whatever the case might be, if it's temporal or if it's spatial, there's enough distinction between the original plant and where the seeds end up that you have these new species emerging. Now the authors found that some of the earliest seeds had this ability, so some of the earliest seeds of all seed-producing plants. And this may have been particularly helpful in plant diversification because in the early stages we had plants that were in the water or in very watery environments, and eventually, of course, we know they emerged and became terrestrial. And when they were doing that, there were tons and tons of places for these seeds to go, but the conditions were going to be very different from how they were in the water. So if you had these plants that were able to kind of wait until the seed got to the right place and then kind of felt out the conditions and had some sort of way to sense what was happening in the environment and then respond appropriately, then those plants are going to be quite successful. And that would allow you to have seeds that go quite a long distance to all sorts of habitat and find a way to grow in those places, even if they are quite different from each other and also from that natal territory. Now, an interesting kind of inverse of this finding is that it's quite possible that plants that don't produce these seeds that undergo dormancy may be more susceptible to extinction associated with environmental change. So that might be anthropogenic habitats where humans have altered the microclimate. So we know, for example, that cities tend to be a lot warmer than outside of cities, and we have that kind of little heat island effect. And lots of other things, chemicals that we put into the environment, whatever the case might be, we have altered the microclimate. And so it might be the case that species that are in those kind of affected areas might be hard hit if they don't have this dormancy, because then they aren't able to respond as quickly as they should to these changes that we're putting in the environment. The same goes, probably even more true, of climate change. So when we've got these changes in when the temperatures are becoming right for growing, so we know that spring has been coming earlier and earlier each year, if plants aren't able to react to that appropriately, then they aren't going to do very well. So this suggests that, sprouting might eventually no longer be in tune with the environment, just as we're seeing kind of the insects doing things a bit out of whack. We know that the birds are also migrating at different times, not in tune with the insects, not in tune with the plants. So all these things are becoming unbalanced, and this might be a real problem for these plants that have no real control over when their seeds are sprouting, because that might mean that the baby plants are coming out before they're really able to mature and reproduce and create their own offspring to carry on their genes. So quite an interesting study here in terms of thinking about both evolutionary history and also what might happen in the future. Welcome back to The Wild Side. This is your host, Caitlin Kight, and that was The Civil Wars with Devil's Backbone. And just before the break, I was talking about some recent science news having to do with the evolution of plants, and now I've got a little tidbit about the evolution of some animals, in particular, land herbivores. So archaeologists working in Kansas have unearthed a 300-million-year-old skeleton of a previously unknown species that they have now named Eocasia martini. And the skeleton, which consisted of a partial skull, most of the vertebral column, the pelvis, and also a hind leg, belonged to a juvenile. And it was also quite a small thing, not just because it was a juvenile, but because the overall species appears to be quite small, or appears to have been quite small. So less than about 8 inches long. And what's interesting is that one of the pictures associated with the report, they showed the animal itself, as they think that it might look, sitting within the footprint of another animal that lived at the same time. And it was a massive footprint and then this little tiny animal within it. So it was amazing to see the variation. And what was even crazier is the fact that these two species would have been related. And so you've got something that's really, really tiny eventually giving rise to that much bigger ancestor in whose footprint that particular individual was sitting. And I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end of this summary. So the researchers did an analysis of the skeletal anatomy of this fossil, and they found that the animal belongs to the caseid branch of the synapsids. Now, I've talked about these guys in depth before on the show, so I won't go into a whole lot of detail now. But basically, this is a group that includes the early terrestrial herbivores and also large carnivores, and is eventually the group that gave rise to modern animals. So these are our ancestors that I'm talking about. Now, this particular species lived about 80 million years before the dinosaurs, and is therefore one of the oldest relatives of modern animals, which means that it's quite an interesting thing to study, because it gives you some insights about, the transitions that we went through as we moved from the water onto the land and kind of changed our life history tactics in order to be able to accommodate this new habitat. Now, prior to this recent discovery, the oldest known caseas were only about 60 million years old. So this significantly extends our knowledge of the evolution of this family, and it also reveals that caseas evolved about 20 million years before we previously thought. So this is quite a significant finding. Now, in addition to being the oldest known caseid, it's also the first known caseid carnivore, which makes it even more interesting. So these animals would have fed on insects and other small animals, whereas more recently evolved caseids were herbivorous. So this is an animal that kind of marks a distinction from the earlier, more carnivorous form of this particular family to the one that we're familiar with now that has a lot of herbivores as well as a few top predators and some omnivores as well. So the descendants of this small non-herbivorous species gave rise to the really large terrestrial herbivores that we know today. So that's why I said I'd get back around to thinking about that really big footprint with a really little animal inside it. Because, within very little time you went from that little tiny 8-inch thing to the giant things that we know today, elephant-like things, mammoth-like things, even bigger things that we have since discovered. So the researchers stated that this species is the first animal to start the process that eventually resulted in a terrestrial ecosystem where you've got kind of the food web type situation that we're familiar with, where you've got a lot of plant eaters that support fewer and fewer top predators as you go up the food chain or the food web. You've only got a few carnivores that kind of are at the apex, and then lots of things that are kind of more generalist, and then down at the very base, you've got lots of things that are herbivore specialists. Now, herbivory did not just evolve in Eocasia, and this is another thing that's kind of interesting about this particular finding and the resulting analyses, because herbivory appears to have arisen independently at least 5 different times, including twice in reptile species. And the scientists believe that maybe there was kind of a threshold where you had a collection of traits that an animal needed to have in order to transition between the carnivory of our ancient ancestors and the herbivory that some of the more modern species eventually developed. So once they accumulated enough of those traits that allowed that transition to be possible, they reached that threshold, and then multiple different groups crossed the threshold into herbivory because suddenly it was much easier for that to happen, and that's why maybe it emerged multiple different times, rather than one single time and then giving rise to a lineage of things that are all herbivores. Now this evolutionary process, this shift from carnivory to a lot of herbivorous animals, proceeded in what the authors referred to as staggered bursts. And so first it occurred among the distant relatives of mammals rather than the ancient reptiles that these things would have been quite similar to. And it led to changes in body size of terrestrial animals. Herbivores, of course, tend to be larger, so thinking about a thing like a cow, for example, much larger than, than even, something like a lion or a tiger that's a carnivore. So by mapping these species on an evolutionary tree, the researchers were able to see that, in particular, there was a real burst in size as the animals were evolving, as species were evolving, I should say. And this happened during the Permian period in particular. And the Permian period came at the end of the Paleozoic era, which is about 250 million years ago. And casiids were the most extreme example of this size increase. So the oldest, which is this recently discovered species, Eocasia, it would have been about 2 kilograms as a full-grown adult, whereas the most recently evolved species was over 500 kilograms. So in a very short period of time, you had this massive burst in size. And this discovery raises lots of questions. So for example, why didn't herbivory happen earlier? Why wasn't it until the Eocasia was evolved that suddenly herbivory seems to have been introduced into the descendants? Why did it happen independently in so many lineages? Is it a threshold thing, or is there something else? And what the authors say here is that the occurrence that they've discovered resulted in, and I'm quoting now, a colossal change in our terrestrial ecosystem. So it's important to try to understand these questions in better detail and to kind of answer these questions and think of the next set of questions in order to think about how you can have changes that allow something to go from an aquatic animal to a terrestrial animal and suddenly be able to colonize all these new different types of habitats. And the more we understand about these sorts of transitionary type phases, actually the better we can estimate what might happen as we continue to see changes in the environment. And I don't just mean things associated with climate change, but in general, as you have these changes in the environment that would just ordinarily occur as we have shifts in weather patterns and in more long-term climate type things, you can begin to get an idea of which animals are likely to do well, which are likely to die out, what are the evolutionary things that are going to happen, is there going to be speciation, all sorts of things like that. So it's interesting to look to the past as I said earlier, to get an idea not only of what happened before, but also to project forward and think about what might happen in the future. So now I have one last study that I want to talk about, and this is going back to birds, which of course are my favorite species, I'm sorry to say, my favorite group of species. So this particular thing that has come out recently actually is kind of a follow-up study on other studies that have happened in the past. And what's happened previously is that some people were out in the field and they saw some interesting things that were kind of, anecdotally interesting, but nothing that was a large enough sample size for them to really validate scientifically. And then some experiments were performed that created some even better data than that and allowed them to kind of to draw some better conclusions about what was really happening. And now they've followed up both of those things with some mathematical modeling to kind of get the theory to see whether it is in line with the experiments. And they found out that actually it does seem to be. And all of this stuff revolves around the fact that there are some species of birds all around the world. We have some here in cuckoos. So species that are brood parasites that lay their eggs in other species' nests. And actually the species that was the focus here is the cowbird, the brown-headed cowbird, which is a species from North America. And even though the researchers were specifically looking at these guys, actually their results are kind of broadly applicable to other brood parasites as well. Now, although the eggs that these guys produce look completely different to host eggs, many hosts keep them anyway, and then they raise the young, which also can look extremely different and be much larger and much more energetically difficult for these guys to take care of. So the main question that this raises is, why don't the hosts retaliate by tossing out the parasitic egg? If the cowbird egg looks so different from theirs, why don't they just toss it out and then get on with the business of raising their own young? And the anecdotal observations in the field suggested that the cowbirds are using what is referred to as mafia behavior. So they're forcing the birds, the host birds, to cooperate by giving them basically no other option but to do so. So how does this behavior work? Well, in the field, what the researchers found was that cowbirds, after they had laid their egg in the host nest, they would go back to check and see if the eggs were still present. If they are, the nest can stay intact, they allow everything to proceed, and their young will be raised by the hosts. If the egg has been tossed out, the cowbirds retaliate by ripping the nest to shreds, destroying all the host eggs, and making those hosts pay for kicking out the cowbird egg. So in theory, the authors say then that you would expect for two conditions to be met in order for this to hold true, and for the mafia behavior thing to actually work. The first of these, they say, is that the host birds must be capable of learning. So they have to learn that kicking out the cowbird egg will bring retaliation, and so maybe they don't want to do it because that's bad. The other thing that they say has to happen is that the cowbirds have to approach the same nest more than once, so that a host that has learned that retaliation will happen will have the chance to change its behavior in order to avoid that retaliation the second time around. So this current study was following up on that field research by developing mathematical models that allowed the researchers to kind of test whether these things did in fact hold true. So they created both a simple model and a complex model, and basically you're just kind of programming computerized birds to go through certain behaviors and then see what happens in the end with reproduction and with behavior. So the simple one is basically they have a computerized bird that lays exactly one egg in a host nest, and then a host can either accept it or reject it, and then reproduce on from there, create more young, and the process keeps happening over generations. They also have a complex situation where you can have the parasite laying multiple eggs, and the host can either accept it or accept or reject each of these eggs in turn. So that means that they have multiple opportunities to make a decision about whether or not to keep that egg. Now, interestingly, what they found was that it didn't actually matter whether they were looking at the simple or the complex model, because they resulted in similar patterns. And what they found was a cyclical dynamic between the host and the parasite, with no equilibrium ever being reached. So there was never any kind of steady state that after a while they all just kind of fell into this same pattern. Instead, they were always cycling back and forth between patterns. And basically, that's a regular cycling between in the frequency of mafia and non-mafia parasites, and in the frequency of hosts that either accept an egg immediately or only accept it after they've gone through the process of experiencing retaliation. So basically, when there are lots of non-mafia brood parasites, there's an advantage to accept only conditionally, so only after learning the hard way that you shouldn't reject. And that's because there isn't a big likelihood that you're going to encounter a retaliator, so there's a pretty good chance that you can kick out an egg and not face any consequences. But this increases the likelihood that an individual host will only be a conditional acceptor, and that means that this will slowly increase the survival probability of mafia-like brood parasites over time. So once these mafia parasites are then in the majority, hosts that accept unconditionally are going to be more successful because then they won't suffer the nest's destruction. And the increase in unconditional acceptance will then make mafia behavior less necessary because all the eggs are being accepted anyway. And that means that eventually you're going to get back to the beginning of the cycle and start it all over again. So in addition to providing insights about the dynamics of specific host-parasite pairs, thinking about the brown-headed cowbird and other things that it might parasitize, this research also lends support to a theory, the mafia hypothesis, that was generated in 1979 and has been argued in the several decades since then. It also raises really interesting questions associated with the fact that in some other parasites, so not the brown-headed cowbird, there are ways of dealing with host rejection that have nothing to do with this particular dynamic, none of this mafia stuff. So for example, the parasites will mimic the eggs, they will specialize in host species, they give birth to young that look like or sound like or behave like the young that they're parasitizing, so all sorts of different things that they can do to make sure that their eggs and their young are going to be more successful. So that raises the question, why do you have some of these things specializing in a particular way of dealing with one specific host, whether it has to do with the look of the egg or the action of the chick, and why do you have some that are specializing specializing and generalizing, so they don't choose any particular phenotype or behavior, instead they just lay their eggs indiscriminately almost, and then kind of bully the hosts into keeping them. So basically you're asking the question, when is it advantageous to do one thing and when is it advantageous to do another? When do you want to engage in mafia behavior and when do you want to choose some of these other more specialized kind of elegant techniques? So the study answers some questions maybe, but then definitely raises lots of others. And that is the nature of science, so that's a very good note for me to end on today. And for the last couple minutes of the show, I will play a bit of Birdy singing Strange Birds. I hope you feel up to date now, and I will talk to you next week.